A lab built to protect humanity from dangerous AI somehow became one of the most valuable private companies ever created. And the wildest part, its own board tried to burn it all down from the inside. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how that happened, who made the calls that nearly destroyed everything, and why the whole saga says something deeply uncomfortable about the future we're all walking into. Let's start at the beginning, because none of this makes sense without understanding what OpenAI actually is and what it was always supposed to be. Imagine a student who has read almost every book ever written. Every novel, every scientific paper, every news article, every forum post, every instruction manual. This student can answer questions on almost any topic in seconds. They can write poems, explain surgery, summarize legal documents, and hold a conversation that feels completely natural. But here's the catch. Sometimes this student just makes things up. They sound totally confident, but they're wrong. That's artificial intelligence in a nutshell, not a magic brain, not a robot that thinks like you do. A pattern recognition machine trained on an ocean of human language, incredibly fast and often impressive, but not always right. Now, a chatbot is simply a way to talk to that system. Instead of typing into a search bar and getting a list of links, you type a question or a request, and the program writes back to you in plain, natural sentences. It feels like texting a very smart person who never sleeps, never gets annoyed, and can switch from helping you write a cover letter to explaining the French Revolution without missing a beat. OpenAI is the company that built the most famous chatbot in the world, ChatGPT. If your parents have mentioned it at dinner, if your teacher warned you about it, if your boss sent a company-wide email about it, that's ChatGPT. It went from a thing tech people talked about to something your grandmother has an opinion on, seemingly overnight. But here's the thing. OpenAI was not built to make money. When the company was founded, it was set up as a nonprofit. That word gets thrown around a lot, so let's break down exactly what it means. A nonprofit has no owners in the traditional sense. Nobody holds shares. Nobody collects dividends. Nobody gets rich when the company grows. The mission, the stated purpose, is the boss, not profit, not profit. Every dollar the organization brings in is supposed to go back into the work itself. You've probably heard of nonprofits in the context of charities or hospitals. OpenAI was that kind of organization, except instead of feeding the hungry or curing disease, its stated mission was to make sure artificial intelligence benefits all of humanity. Not one company, not one country, all of humanity. Think about how unusual that is. The people building what many consider the most powerful technology since the internet decided, at least at the start, to do it without the normal financial incentives driving almost every other tech company. No shareholders screaming for quarterly growth, no stock price to protect, just the mission. Now, running any organization takes money, and running an AI lab takes enormous amounts of it. So, OpenAI did accept donations and outside funding. But the structure was supposed to keep greed from taking over the wheel. Into this setup walked Sam Altman. Sam Altman became the CEO and co-founder of OpenAI, and his arrangement with the company is one of the strangest deals in the history of Silicon Valley. He runs a company that has grown into one of the most watched organizations on the planet. He makes major decisions about its direction every single day, and yet he owns 0% of the company. None, not a fraction. The man does not hold a single share of equity in OpenAI. And his salary for tax year 2023? $76,001 a year. To put that in perspective, that's less than many mid-level software engineers make at companies far smaller than OpenAI. For most CEOs of companies at this scale, we'd be talking about compensation packages worth hundreds of millions of dollars in stock alone. Altman gets none of that, at least not in the way most executives do. Why would someone take that deal? That's a question worth sitting with, and we'll come back to it. Then there's Ilya Sutskever, co-founder, chief scientist. The person inside OpenAI who thought the deepest and most seriously about what this technology could actually mean for the world. Sutskever wasn't just building AI, he was obsessed with it in the way that keeps you up at 3 in the morning. He believed, genuinely and deeply, that artificial intelligence could either be the best thing that ever happened to human civilization, or the last thing that ever happened to it. That's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. That's the actual framework he and many of his colleagues operated from. The upside could be curing every disease, solving climate change, eliminating poverty. The downside could be existential. So for Sutskever, getting the safety question right wasn't a side project. It was the whole point. He was, in many ways, the scientific soul of OpenAI. While Altman handled the business side, the fundraising, the relationships, the strategy, Sutskever was in the research trenches asking whether they were building something they could actually control. And for a while, the two of them, along with a broader team of researchers and engineers, built something that genuinely captured the world's attention. ChatGPT launched and grew faster than almost any consumer product in recorded history. By November 2023, the platform had 100 million weekly active users. 100 million people, every single week, typing questions into a chat window and getting back answers that ranged from helpful to astonishing to occasionally hilariously wrong. People used it to write emails, study for exams, draft business plans, settle arguments, learn new languages, and process grief. It became a part of daily life for an enormous slice of the global population, faster than social media, faster than smartphones, faster than almost anything. But here's the thing about building something that powerful inside an organization that was never supposed to be a money-making machine. The tension was always there, just waiting for the right moment to blow. And on November 17, 2023, it blew. The board of OpenAI, the people legally in charge of making sure the nonprofit stayed true to its mission, fired Sam Altman. Not quietly, not with a transition plan, not with weeks of negotiation. They fired him on a Friday. The reason they gave, in the official statement, was a lack of consistent candor. Translated into plain language, the board said Altman wasn't being fully honest with them. He wasn't keeping them in the loop the way he should have been. Altman was out. Just like that. Mira Murati, who served as the company's chief technology officer, was installed as interim CEO while the dust settled. She was stepping into a position nobody wanted under those circumstances, tasked with holding together a company that was rapidly spinning into chaos. Because what happened next was not quiet. It was not orderly. The employees of OpenAI, the researchers, the engineers, the people who had built this thing, revolted. Staff members began signing a letter threatening to walk out en masse if Altman was not reinstated. The number of signatures grew fast. Microsoft, which had poured billions of dollars into OpenAI, applied its own enormous pressure. The message from all sides was essentially the same: put Sam Altman back, or watch this company collapse in real time. 5 days after he was fired, on November 22, 2023, Sam Altman walked back through the door as CEO. The board was restructured. The people who had voted to fire him were largely gone. Altman was back, and he rejoined the board alongside the new structure. A law firm called Wilmer was brought in to investigate the whole thing, to figure out what actually happened, who knew what, and whether the firing was justified. Their conclusion, delivered on March 8, 2024, was that Altman's conduct did not warrant his removal. The board expressed what it called full confidence in him. But here's the detail that should make anyone paying attention raise an eyebrow. Wilmer conducted this investigation into one of the most dramatic corporate governance moments in recent memory. A moment that shook a company valued in the hundreds of billions, and they never produced a written report. No document, no formal findings, nothing on paper. That decision was reportedly made on the advice of board members' personal attorneys. So the investigation happened, the conclusion was delivered, and then there was no paper trail to examine, challenge, or hold anyone accountable to. The investigation was closed. Altman was back. And from the outside, it looked like the crisis was over. But two of the people who cared most deeply about why OpenAI existed in the first place were about to walk out the door. So there was Altman, back in his chair 5 days after being shown the door, with a new board around him and a law firm's verbal blessing that he had done nothing wrong. No paper trail, no formal document. Just a handshake conclusion and a company told to move on. But moving on is complicated when the conflict that caused the explosion never actually went away. To understand why that is, you have to go back to what happened between the founding of OpenAI and that Friday afternoon in November 2023, because the firing did not come out of nowhere. It was the end result of a slow-building argument that had been happening inside that company since before most people had ever heard the word ChatGPT. OpenAI launched ChatGPT in late 2022. And what made it different from everything that came before, it was dead simple. You did not need to be a programmer. You did not need to understand how any of it worked. You just opened a browser, typed a question like you were sending a text message, and got a real answer back. Not a list of links, not a search result you had to sift through. An actual response, written in plain English, as if a very knowledgeable person on the other end had read your question and typed back. You could ask it to write a cover letter. You could ask it to explain why the sky is blue. You could ask it to summarize a 50-page legal contract, or help you plan a dinner party, or tell you what to say to a friend going through a hard time, for free. No download, no account required at first, no technical knowledge necessary. Just type and get an answer. The world had never seen anything quite like it, and the world made that extremely clear. By November 2023, 100 million people were using ChatGPT every single week. Put that number in human terms. 100 million is roughly the entire population of a large country. Imagine every single person in a nation the size of the Philippines or Mexico logging onto the same website in a 7-day stretch just to have a conversation with a piece of software. That is what happened. It became one of the fastest adopted products in history, not because a marketing campaign told people to use it, but because people tried it, walked away slightly stunned, and immediately told someone else to try it too. But here's the thing. Inside the building where all of this was being celebrated, not everyone was celebrating in the same way. There were two very different ways of looking at what had just happened, and the gap between those two views would eventually crack the company open. One camp looked at the numbers and felt something like relief mixed with pride. Getting this technology into as many hands as possible, as fast as possible, was always the plan. Sam Altman sat at the center of this thinking. His argument was not that safety did not matter. His argument was that if powerful AI was going to be built anyway, and he believed it absolutely was, then it was better for a company that cared about safety to build it first than to let someone with no such concern get there ahead of them. Speed was not recklessness in his view. Speed was strategy. He believed OpenAI could learn faster, course-correct faster, and set better standards for the whole industry by being out front rather than hanging back out of fear. The other camp looked at those same 100 million users and felt something closer to dread. Ilya Sutskever, the co-founder who served as chief scientist and was, as mentioned earlier, the scientific heart of the company, kept coming back to a question that made some of his colleagues uncomfortable. Do we actually understand what we built? Not in a philosophical way, in a practical, engineering way. Do we know what this thing is doing inside? Do we know why it gives the answers it gives? Do we know what it would do if it encountered a situation we had not anticipated? The honest answer, then as now, was not fully. The models were trained on enormous amounts of text. They got very good at predicting what a useful, coherent response would look like. But the inner workings, the actual reason a model produced one answer instead of another, were not fully visible even to the people who built them. Sutskever treated this not as a minor technical gap to be closed later, but as a warning sign that deserved serious attention before pushing further ahead. This was not a small disagreement between two departments. It was a disagreement about the most basic question a company like this could ask itself. What are we actually doing here, and how fast should we be doing it? The safety-first camp argued that releasing something you do not fully understand to 100 million people before you have figured out the risks was gambling with consequences that could not be undone. The speed-first camp argued that slowing down was its own kind of gamble, that it handed the lead to competitors who would not be asking these questions at all. Both sides thought they were protecting the world. They just had completely opposite ideas about how to do that. Altman kept pushing forward. New products, new partnerships, new deals. The company's reach was expanding at a pace that seemed to accelerate every quarter. Sutskever kept pulling back, asking harder questions, insisting that the team had a responsibility to understand what they were unleashing before they unleashed more of it. Inside OpenAI, this tension was constant. It shaped which projects got prioritized, which research got funded, which conversations happened in which rooms. And it lived not just in meeting minutes or strategy documents, but in the daily friction between people who genuinely, deeply disagreed about something that actually mattered. And the board, the small group of people technically in charge of deciding whether OpenAI was living up to its founding mission, was watching all of this. OpenAI's board was unusual, because the company started as a nonprofit. No shareholders demanding returns, no profit motive steering decisions. The board's job was not to maximize value for investors. Its job was to protect the mission. And the mission, from the very beginning, was to make sure that artificial intelligence was developed in a way that was good for humanity, not just good for business. When some board members started feeling like that distinction was getting blurry, like the drive to grow and ship and expand was crowding out the careful, slower work of understanding what they were building, that was not just a disagreement about business strategy. To them, it was a mission failure. And then, on a Friday afternoon in November 2023, that conflict exploded, not in a memo, not in a press release, in a phone call that Sam Altman was not expecting, from a board that had already made up its mind, and a decision that would send shockwaves through the entire technology industry before the weekend was over. The call lasted only a few minutes. Altman was told he was fired. No warning meeting, no performance review, no period of reflection. The board had voted, and the vote was done. The official reason, delivered in a statement shortly after, was that Altman had not been consistently candid with the board. That phrase, consistently candid, was vague enough to mean almost anything, and specific enough to suggest that whatever the board had seen, they had been watching for a while. What followed was unlike anything the technology industry had witnessed in recent memory. Within hours, the news was everywhere. Employees inside the company were blindsided. Microsoft, which had invested billions of dollars into OpenAI and built significant parts of its own future on the company's technology, learned about the firing from the same public statement everyone else read. Greg Brockman, one of the other co-founders and the company's president, resigned in solidarity with Altman the same day. Senior researchers began signaling that they too would walk out the door if Altman did not come back. The board had expected turbulence. It had not expected a near-total collapse of the organization it was trying to protect. Over that weekend, the pressure built in a way that was almost impossible to describe from the outside. More than 700 of OpenAI's roughly 770 employees signed an open letter saying they would leave and follow Altman to Microsoft, where he had already been offered a role, unless the board reversed course. Investors were furious. The logic of firing someone for vague candor concerns while simultaneously threatening the survival of the entire enterprise was not landing well with anyone who had money or reputation tied to the company's future. Ilya Sutskever, who had been one of the board members who voted to remove Altman, signed that letter too. It was a remarkable reversal, and he said publicly that he deeply regretted his part in what had happened. The man who had been the cautious voice, the one asking whether the team truly understood what it was building, had voted to pull the emergency brake and then watched the car he was riding in nearly go off a cliff anyway. By the following Wednesday, the board was in an entirely different position than it had been on Friday, and by November 22, 2023, just 5 days after the firing, Altman was back. The board members who had voted him out were themselves gone, replaced with new faces. The restructured board quickly made clear it had no interest in revisiting the removal. The law firm WilmerHale was brought in, conducted its review, spoke to people, weighed the evidence, and arrived at its verbal conclusion: the firing had been unjustified. What nobody did in all of that was write any of it down in a formal report. No document. No public accounting of exactly what had happened and why. Just a verbal finding and an instruction to move forward, which meant that the underlying argument, the one about speed versus caution, about whether you could responsibly release something you did not fully understand to hundreds of millions of people, never got resolved. It just got papered over by the urgency of keeping the company intact. Sutskever stayed for a few months more, but the writing was on the wall. In May 2024, he announced his resignation. Not long after, Jan Leik, who led the team focused specifically on making sure AI systems behaved safely and as intended, resigned as well. Leik was not quiet about his reasons. He said publicly that he had struggled for resources, that priorities had felt misaligned, that the balance between building fast and building carefully had shifted in a direction he could not support. Two of the most prominent voices for slowing down and asking harder questions had now left the building. The accelerator camp had not just survived the Friday afternoon explosion. In a meaningful sense, it had won. But winning an internal argument is different from settling the question that argument was about. And the question, do we actually understand what we are building and what happens if we do not, did not leave when Sutskever and Leik did. It followed the company out into the world, where 100 million weekly users were already depending on the answers. November 17, 2023, a Friday afternoon in San Francisco. Sam Altman gets a message asking him to join a video call with the board of OpenAI. He probably assumes it is routine. A check-in, maybe some paperwork. He joins the call. The board member on the other end gets straight to the point. Altman asks what this is about. The board member says they have lost confidence in him. Altman says he did not see this coming. He didn't. Nobody outside that room did, and within minutes, one of the most powerful people in the technology industry was no longer employed by the company he helped build from nothing. The official reason the board gave was a lack of consistent candor, which, in plain language, meant they said he wasn't being straight with them. No further explanation was offered publicly. No severance announcement. No long goodbye. Just a short statement released to the press saying Sam Altman had been removed as chief executive, effective immediately. The speed of it was shocking. The silence around it was even more strange. But here's the thing. OpenAI is not a normal company. As mentioned earlier, it was built as a non-profit, meaning it was never owned by any individual and was not designed to make anyone rich. The board that fired Altman had a legal duty to protect the mission, not the shareholders, because there were no shareholders in the traditional sense. They had the power to fire the chief executive even if every employee, every investor, and every user in the world disagreed with them. And on that Friday afternoon, they used it. What they didn't count on was what happened next. Within hours of the announcement, the reaction inside OpenAI was not confusion. It was fury. Mira Murati, the company's chief technology officer, was named interim chief executive almost immediately. Murati had been at OpenAI for years, leading the engineering and research teams that actually built the products people were using. She was respected. She was capable. And she found herself sitting in the middle of a company that was close to open revolt. Employees started talking. Then they started organizing. Then hundreds of them signed a letter that made the situation impossible to ignore. The letter said, in effect, that if Sam Altman was not brought back, they would leave. Not a few people. Not a vocal minority. The vast majority of the company's workforce threatened to walk out the door together, which would have meant no engineers, no researchers, no product teams, and no company. Workers chose their boss over their boss's bosses, and they were willing to lose their jobs to prove it. That is not something that happens often anywhere, let alone at one of the most closely watched technology companies on the planet. And just like that, the pressure expanded beyond the walls of OpenAI's office. Microsoft had invested billions of dollars into OpenAI. The relationship between the two companies was not casual. Microsoft had built products, services, and forward-looking business plans on top of OpenAI's technology. When the board fired Altman on Friday, Microsoft did not simply watch from a distance. With billions of dollars tied to OpenAI's success, this was not a governance drama they could afford to sit out. It became a financial emergency, and Microsoft made its position known loudly and clearly. The board had thought they were making a decision about leadership. What they had actually done was light a match in a room full of people who had every reason to fight back, and who had the resources and numbers to make the fallout catastrophic. The weekend that followed was unlike anything the technology industry had seen in years. Negotiations, phone calls, public statements, reports of Altman potentially starting a new company, reports of board members considering reversals. The story changed almost by the hour. Some of the board members who had voted to remove Altman reportedly began to waver. Others held firm. The public was watching a governance crisis play out in real time through leaked messages and breathless reporting, and nobody seemed to know how it would end. By November 22, 2023, exactly 5 days after the firing, it ended. Sam Altman walked back through the door as chief executive. 5 days. That is all it took for the board's decision to collapse entirely. And the board members who had voted him out were themselves gone, replaced by a new set of names on a restructured board that made clear, almost immediately, it had no interest in revisiting what had happened. The new board expressed full confidence in Altman. He also rejoined the board himself. The people who had pulled the trigger on that Friday afternoon call were now the ones who were out. But the story does not end with the chair being filled again. Because a question that big, one that destabilized a company with 100 million weekly users and forced a 5-day crisis that dragged in Microsoft and sent Silicon Valley into a frenzy, deserved a serious answer. Who was right? Had the board acted out of principle or out of fear? Was there actually something Altman had withheld from them, or was this a panic move dressed up in governance language? These were not small questions. They were exactly the kind of questions that a formal investigation should answer. WilmerHale, a well-regarded law firm, was brought in to do exactly that. They spoke to people, they gathered information, they weighed what they found, and they arrived at a conclusion. The firing had been unjustified. Altman's behavior did not rise to the level that demanded his removal. That should have been the end of it. Documented, sealed, and available for anyone who needed to understand what actually happened and why. Except there was no document. WilmerHale delivered its findings verbally. No formal written report was produced. Reportedly, that decision was made on the advice of board members' personal lawyers, which means the conclusion existed, but not in any form that could be reviewed, challenged, or held up to public scrutiny. The most consequential week in OpenAI's history was investigated by a major law firm, and what came out the other side was a verbal summary and a return to business. That detail matters more than it might appear. When a company that claims to be working on technology that could reshape civilization has a crisis this large and chooses not to write down what caused it or what was found, the absence of paperwork is itself a statement. It says the priority was getting back to work, not accounting for what broke down. So everyone moved forward. The employees who had threatened to quit went back to their desks. Microsoft returned to its partnership. Murati stepped back from the interim role. Altman was in his chair. The new board was in place. The public narrative was that OpenAI had survived its worst week and come out the other side intact. And on the surface, that was true. But the thing that had actually been at the center of all of this, the argument between moving fast and moving carefully, between shipping powerful technology quickly and slowing down to understand it first, that argument never got resolved. It just got buried under the urgency of keeping the company alive. Ilya Sutskever, as mentioned earlier, had been the loudest voice asking the harder questions. He had voted to remove Altman. He had then, famously and publicly, expressed regret about his role in what happened. He stayed with the company for a few months more after November, but by May of 2024, he was gone. He announced his resignation, and the company he had co-founded, the company he believed could either save or end civilization depending on how carefully it was built, continued without him. Jan Leik, who had led the team specifically focused on making sure AI systems behaved in ways that were safe and predictable, left not long after Sutskever. Leik did not leave quietly. He said publicly that his team had struggled for resources, that the balance between building fast and building safely had shifted in a direction he could not accept, that the priorities he believed in had been pushed aside. He named it directly. The company had moved towards speed and away from caution. Two people, both co-founders or senior leaders, both among the most prominent voices for slowing down and asking harder questions before releasing technology to hundreds of millions of people. Both out the door within months of the crisis that was supposed to have been resolved. The investigation is over. Altman is back in his chair. The board is new. The company is moving. But the two people who built the soul of this place, who cared most about what it was supposed to be, are already packing their bags. And when they leave, everything changes. What Like said on his way out deserves to sit with us for a moment, because it was not a vague complaint from someone who had lost a power struggle. He was specific. He said that safety culture and safety processes had taken a back seat to product development. He said the teams working on alignment, which is the technical problem of making sure an AI system actually does what humans intend and not something subtly different, were under-resourced relative to the teams racing to ship the next model. He was not speaking in abstractions. He was describing a budget and a priority list. Think of it this way. Imagine you are building the fastest car ever made. You have two TMs. One team is working on the engine, making it more powerful, making it faster, making it ready for the road. The other team is working on the brakes. Like was saying, the brake team kept getting told to wait their turn, and eventually he could not pretend that was acceptable anymore. That is the thing about a mission like the one OpenAI was founded on. It is not enough to state it in founding documents. It has to show up in how money is spent, how teams are staffed, which projects get approved and which get shelved. When the people responsible for the break start leaving and writing public letters about it, that is not a personnel story. That is an engineering story. It is telling you something about the machine. And meanwhile, the machine kept accelerating. The user numbers that stood at 100 million weekly active users in November of 2023, the same month Altman was fired and reinstated, did not slow down or plateau in the turbulence. They climbed. The companies built on top of OpenAI's tools kept building. The revenue kept growing. The demand kept pulling the company forward at a pace that made it almost structurally impossible to pause and take stock of what was being released and how fast. The 5 days between firing and reinstatement had settled the question of who was in charge. But they had not settled, and could not settle, the deeper question underneath it, which was what the company was actually for. Was it a safety mission that happened to need commercial success to survive? Or was it a commercial enterprise that kept the language of safety as a kind of promise about intentions? Both of those things cannot be equally true at the same time, and the people best positioned to hold the line on that distinction were now outside the building. The chair is warm. The company is intact. But the people who built the conscience of this place have already made their decision. The chair was warm, the company was intact, and Sam Altman was back at the head of the table. But winning a power struggle is not the same as winning an argument. The deeper question, what is this company actually for, was still sitting in the middle of the room when Altman walked back through the door in November of 2023. Nobody answered it during the 5 days of chaos. Nobody answered it during the WilmerHale investigation. And so it stayed there, quiet and unresolved, while the people who had been asking it loudest started making other plans. May 14, 2024. Ilya Sutskever posts a short message saying he is leaving OpenAI. No dramatic press conference. No lengthy manifesto. Just a quiet exit from the person who, more than anyone else inside that building, had spent years asking the one question that made everyone else uncomfortable, but what if this goes wrong? Sutskever was not just a co-founder. He was the person who had pushed hardest on the question of whether the AI being built was actually safe. He had been so committed to that question that he was reportedly one of the board members who voted to fire Altman in the first place, in part because of concerns about how fast the company was moving. And now he was the one walking out. A colleague stopped him in the hallway before he made it official. The colleague asked if he was really leaving, if he had really made up his mind. Sutskever said he had to. He said the work he believed in, the work of making sure the technology was safe before it was powerful, was not the work being prioritized. That the gap between what he thought the company should be doing and what the company was actually doing had gotten too wide to bridge from the inside. The colleague did not push back. There was not much to say. Sutskever's departure on its own might have been read as one person's decision, a co-founder moving on after a turbulent year, the kind of thing that happens at any company going through upheaval. But here is the thing, he was not the only one leaving. Jan Like had been the head of OpenAI's super alignment team. That title sounds technical, but the job description is actually pretty simple. The super alignment team existed to figure out one thing. How do you keep a super intelligent AI, one smarter than any human, from doing things that humans would not want it to do? How do you stay in control of something that might, one day, be better at thinking than you are? That was the assignment. And Lake resigned shortly after Sutskever did. He did not stay quiet about why. Lake made his reasons public, and they were specific. His team had been fighting for computing power, the raw processing resources needed to run safety experiments, and they kept losing that fight to the teams building products. Every time there was a choice between giving more resources to the safety research side and giving more resources to the side launching new features and new models, the product side won. Over and over again. The break team, as mentioned earlier in describing how this worked, kept getting told to wait. Lake was now saying it publicly, in his own words, and adding something more pointed on top of it. He had fundamental disagreements with leadership about what the company's core priorities actually were. Safety research was not just under-resourced. It was, in his view, not genuinely prioritized at all. Think about what the super-alignment team was supposed to do. You're building something that could, by the company's own admission, eventually surpass human intelligence. The super-alignment team is the group whose entire job is making sure that when that happens, the machine still does what humans want it to do. Now imagine that team keeps having to beg for the tools they need to do that job, while the team working on the next product launch gets what it needs without asking twice. That is not a resource allocation story. That is a value story. It tells you what the organization actually believes matters, regardless of what it says in the mission statement. Like left. Sutskever left. And the exits kept coming. September of 2024. Mira Murati announced her departure from OpenAI. She had been the chief technology officer, one of the most senior technical voices in the company. She was also, as mentioned earlier, the person who had been placed in the interim CEO chair during the 5 days of chaos in November of 2023. She had been the face of the company during its most publicly chaotic moment, the person called on to hold things together. And now, less than a year after that, she was gone. Count them up. Sutskever in May. Lake shortly after. Murati in September. 3 of the most prominent co-founder level or safety-focused voices at the company, gone within less than 12 months. Each one represented something different. Sutskever was the original scientific conscience. Lake was the person operationalizing what safety research actually looked like. Murati was the senior technical leader who had also become the symbol of continuity during the company's worst crisis. When all 3 walk out inside the same year, that is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And the pattern was unfolding against a backdrop that made it even harder to ignore. Because while the safety voices were walking out the front door, something very different was happening to the business. The revenue numbers were not just growing. They were growing in a way that made the exits look, to some people, like the cost of doing business at scale. By February of 2026, OpenAI's annualized revenue had reached $25 billion. By August of 2026, the company was pulling in around $2 billion every single month. 92% of Fortune 500 companies were using OpenAI products. Over 1 million businesses were customers. More than 600,000 of those were enterprise customers using ChatGPT directly. To put those numbers in context, the company had gone from a nonprofit that did not sell anything to a business generating $25 billion a year in annualized revenue, all without going public. No stock market listing, no IPO, just private money and product sales at a scale that almost no startup in history has ever reached. On October 28, 2025, OpenAI made it official. The company converted from a nonprofit to a public benefit corporation. That phrase needs unpacking. A public benefit corporation is a legal structure that says a company can make money and pursue a public mission at the same time. It is different from a regular corporation, where the only legal obligation is to shareholders. A public benefit corporation gets to write a mission into its charter and hold it alongside the profit motive. There are fewer than 24 publicly traded companies that use this structure. What it meant practically for OpenAI was this: the original nonprofit did not disappear. It retained an equity stake in the new public benefit corporation, a stake valued at over $100 billion. So the nonprofit that was founded with a no-profit, mission-only structure now holds more than $100 billion of ownership in a for-profit company. The mission is still there, written into the structure, but it now shares the room with the obligation to generate returns. Then January 21, 2025. Standing in front of cameras with the President of the United States, Sam Altman announced Project Stargate, a $500 billion plan, not a product, not a model. Infrastructure. The goal was to build the physical computing foundation that next-generation AI would need to run on, spread across the United States over 4 years. The first data center was already being built in Abilene, Texas. The partners named were SoftBank, Microsoft, Oracle, and NVIDIA. The initial deployment was $100 billion. The full commitment, $500 billion over 4 years. That number alone tells you something about the trajectory the company was on. This was not a startup trying to find product-market fit. This was an organization betting $500 billion on the idea that it would still be at the center of the AI industry 4 years from now. But here is the thing that the revenue numbers alone do not show. All of that growth, all of those business customers, all of that monthly revenue, and the company was still losing money at a scale that is almost hard to understand. OpenAI recorded an operating loss of $20,920 million in 2025. For every dollar it earned, it spent $1.70. like a lemonade stand that charges $1 a cup but spends $1.70 to make each one, except the lemonade stand is worth nearly $1 trillion and has 92% of the Fortune 500 as customers. This is the part that makes the story genuinely strange. OpenAI is not losing money because nobody wants what it sells. People desperately want what it sells. The problem is the cost of building and running the systems that produce it. The computing power required to train and operate these models costs more than the revenue those models generate. And OpenAI projected spending around $50 billion on computing in 2026 alone, with an average target of $100 billion per year through 2030. So the company is worth close to $1 trillion on paper. It is generating $25 billion a year in revenue. It lost nearly $21 billion in a single year while doing it. And the people who built its safety infrastructure are gone. The company that was founded to prevent an AI catastrophe had become the fastest-growing enterprise software business on the planet. And it was somehow losing more money than almost any company in history while doing it. Which raises a question that the board, the investors, and eventually the public are all going to have to answer together. Because when a company this big and this unprofitable decides it needs to stop losing money, there is really only one place left to turn. So let's pick up right where the numbers left us standing. Staring at a company generating $25 billion a year in revenue and somehow spending $1.70 for every dollar it takes in. That paradox did not appear overnight, and it did not happen accidentally. It was built, decision by decision, into the legal and financial structure of the company itself. Because before the money could get this big, OpenAI had to change what kind of company it was allowed to be. October 28, 2025. That is the date the original promise officially changed. On that day, OpenAI completed its conversion from a nonprofit organization into a public benefit corporation, a legal structure that most people have never heard of, and for good reason. There are fewer than 24 public companies in the United States that carry this classification. It is genuinely rare, and what it means matters, so let's make it simple. A regular company has one job: make money for the people who own it. Every decision flows through that filter. A nonprofit has one job: serve the mission. There are no owners in the traditional sense, and no profits get distributed. A public benefit corporation tries to do both at the same time. It is legally allowed to make money and distribute that money to shareholders, and it is also supposed to serve some defined public benefit. The idea is that you can build a profitable business without abandoning the thing you said you stood for. That sounds reasonable in theory, but here's what it means in practice for OpenAI specifically. Before October 28, 2025, OpenAI operated under a structure where the mission was the only boss. There were no shareholders expecting a financial return. The people giving money were doing it because they believed in what the organization was trying to do, not because they expected to get richer. After October 28, 2025, investors can now expect a financial return. That is a legal change, not just a philosophical one. The people with the most money now have a direct financial stake in how the company behaves, which means they have a direct interest in the decisions the company makes. And when the needs of the mission and the needs of the investors start pulling in different directions, there is no longer a clean answer about which one wins. The old nonprofit did not disappear entirely. It retained an equity stake in the new public benefit corporation valued at over $100 billion. Picture it this way: the original version of OpenAI, the one that existed to save the world from dangerous AI, became a shareholder in the new version of OpenAI, the one that exists to do that and also make money. The old mission doesn't govern anymore. It just owns a very large slice. A journalist put this to Sam Altman not long after the conversion was announced. "Is this just a regular company now?" the journalist asked. "The mission hasn't changed," Altman said. "Who enforces that?" the journalist asked. Altman paused. That pause is the whole story. Because the honest answer is that the enforcement mechanism, the thing that guarantees the mission stays in charge when money pulls in a different direction, is not obvious. When you go from "we exist to benefit humanity" to "we also need to return money to investors," you create a situation where two different goals live inside the same legal structure. And someone, eventually, has to decide which one wins when they disagree. OpenAI has not answered that question in a way that satisfies its critics. The public benefit corporation structure requires reporting on how the public benefit is being served, but it does not give a court or a regulator the power to override a financial decision simply because it conflicts with the stated mission. The fact that fewer than 24 public companies carry this classification tells you something too. It is not a widely tested structure. It has not been stress tested in the courts the way a regular corporation has over decades. OpenAI is not just betting on a business model. It is betting on a legal framework that almost nobody else has tried at anything close to this scale. And the scale, as mentioned earlier with the revenue and loss numbers, was becoming almost impossible to comprehend. By February 2026, OpenAI's annualized revenue had reached $25 billion. By August 2026, the company was pulling in around $2 billion every single month. 92% of Fortune 500 companies were using its products. Over 1 million businesses were customers, with more than 600,000 of those classified as enterprise customers using ChatGPT. That is not a startup. That is a mature enterprise software business growing at a speed that has no real comparison in the history of private technology companies. And yet, as described earlier, the company lost $20,920 million in 2025 while doing it. The reason those two facts can both be true at the same time comes down to infrastructure. Training and running the AI models that generate all of that revenue costs more than the revenue itself, and OpenAI was not slowing down the spending. The company projected spending around $50 billion on computing in 2026 alone, with an average target of $100 billion per year through 2030. That is not a company trying to reach profitability quietly. That is a company betting that if it builds enough, fast enough, the math will eventually flip in its favor. Project Stargate was the clearest expression of that bet. Announced on January 21, 2025, it was a $500 billion plan to build next-generation AI infrastructure across the United States over 4 years. The initial commitment was $100 billion, deployed immediately. The first major data center was planned for Abilene, Texas. SoftBank and OpenAI led the project, with Oracle, Microsoft, and NVIDIA as major partners. $500 billion. For context, that is more money than the entire gross domestic product of many countries. And it was structured as a joint venture, meaning OpenAI was not writing that check alone. But it was at the center of the agreement, and the direction of that infrastructure build would shape what kind of AI gets built and where. When you put these pieces together, the public benefit corporation conversion, the $100 billion nonprofit shareholder stake, the $25 billion in annual revenue, the $20 billion annual loss, and the $500 billion infrastructure plan, a picture emerges that is hard to square with the original founding documents. This is not a research lab trying to navigate the risks of superintelligent AI carefully, with commercial activity as a reluctant side project. This is one of the most aggressive capital deployments in the history of private enterprise, run by a company that is still technically required to serve humanity's best interests, with a legal structure that almost no one else has tried, enforced by a mechanism that a journalist's simple question exposed as unclear. The people who might have held that line internally, who would have sat in the room and said, "But wait, are we moving too fast? Is the safety work keeping up with the product work?" had already made their decisions, as covered earlier. Ilya Sutskever was gone. Jan Leik was gone, after saying publicly that his team was losing the fight for computing resources. Mira Murati was gone, the third senior figure to exit in under a year. What filled the space they left behind was something that looked a lot less like a mission and a lot more like a growth machine. 92% of Fortune 500 adoption, over 1 million business customers. $2 billion a month. A valuation creeping toward $1 trillion on paper, and still somehow losing money faster than almost any company in history. Which brings us to the question that nobody at the company seemed to want to answer out loud. If you are worth nearly $1 trillion on paper, burning through capital at this rate, and you have investors who now have a legal expectation of financial return, there is really only one way out of that math, and it requires something that OpenAI had been quietly preparing for longer than most people realized. The answer to that math was a public offering, and by June of 2026, OpenAI had stopped preparing quietly. The company filed its S-1 prospectus with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the formal document that begins the process of selling shares to the general public. An initial public offering, an IPO, would let ordinary investors buy into OpenAI for the first time, and it would give the company access to a pool of capital that even the largest private funding rounds could not match. In August 2026, Chief Financial Officer Sarah Fryer confirmed the plan openly. The target was 2027, contingent, she said, on sustained business momentum. That phrase, sustained business momentum, is the kind of language that sounds careful but carries enormous weight. It means the company knows the path to an IPO is not guaranteed. The momentum has to hold. The revenue has to keep climbing. The losses have to stop looking permanent. But getting to that point required walking through a different kind of turbulence first. The executive departures that had begun with Ilya Sutskever and continued through Mira Murati did not stop. By August 2026, at least 14 senior leaders had left the company. Among them was Brad Lightcap, the chief operating officer, who had been with OpenAI for 8 years. 8 years, in the context of a company founded in 2015, means he was there for nearly the whole story. Chief Revenue Officer Dali Rajic was brought in to fill part of the gap left behind. The restructuring was deep enough that analysts began using the phrase brain drain in their coverage, raising questions about whether the institutional knowledge needed to actually execute an IPO was walking out the door faster than it could be replaced. Greg Brockman, the company's president, pushed back on that framing. Executive turnover at a company growing this fast, he argued, is normal. The scrutiny is amplified by how closely the world is watching. That may be true, but the scrutiny itself is not accidental. OpenAI invited it by claiming a mission unlike any other technology company, by operating under structures that almost no one else uses, and by making decisions large enough to affect national infrastructure, labor markets, and the basic question of what intelligence means in the modern world. The SEC was watching too. A formal investigation was opened into whether investors had been misled during the chaos surrounding Sam Altman's firing in November 2023. And in June 2026, a coalition of 42 state attorneys general issued a subpoena to the company, focusing on business practices, data handling, and AI safety measures. 42 states. That is not a fringe concern. That is a coordinated signal from regulators across the country that the transformation OpenAI had undergone, from nonprofit research lab to one of the most heavily capitalized private companies in American history, had not gone unnoticed and had not been accepted without question. All of this was converging at once. The IPO clock running, the regulatory pressure building, the safety researchers mostly gone, the investors expecting returns, the infrastructure spending at a scale that required the company to keep growing simply to justify what it had already spent. And somewhere inside that structure, still written into the legal documents, still technically in force, the original promise that all of this existed for the benefit of humanity. The question the journalist asked, Sam Altman, who enforces that, was not rhetorical. It was the load-bearing question of the entire enterprise. And the answer, as of the moment OpenAI moved toward the public markets, remained genuinely open. The conscience of the company had already walked out the door. What came next was the money, and the money was unlike anything the technology industry had seen before. By February 2026, OpenAI was generating $25 billion in annualized revenue. Let that number sit for a second. $25 billion a year. That works out to roughly $2 billion every single month by August 2026. For a company that started as a nonprofit research lab with no intention of selling anything, that figure is almost difficult to put in context. The user base that made it possible had grown from 100 million weekly active users in November 2023 to 900 million by February 2026. 900 million people interacting with the product every single week. That is not a niche technology product. That is infrastructure. But here is the thing. More money coming in does not automatically mean a healthy business. And this is where OpenAI's financial picture gets genuinely strange. Think about a lemonade stand. You charge $1 for every cup. $1 seems fine. $1 seems like profit. But if it costs you $1.70 to make that cup, the lemons, the sugar, the ice, the cups, the electricity for the machine, then every single cup you sell puts you deeper in the hole. Sell 10 cups, you lose $7. Sell 1,000 cups, you lose $700. The more popular your lemonade stand becomes, the faster you go broke. Selling more does not fix the problem. It makes it worse. That is almost exactly what OpenAI's numbers showed in 2025. The company recorded an operating loss of $20.920 billion. Not a small shortfall, not a rounding error. $20.920 billion lost while the revenue was climbing. They were spending approximately $1.70 for every dollar they brought in. The lemonade stand was the most popular lemonade stand anyone had ever seen, with 900 million people lining up, and it was hemorrhaging money with every cup poured. The reason comes down to one word: compute. Running an AI model like ChatGPT is not like running a website. A website mostly just sends text files back and forth. An AI model has to do an enormous amount of mathematics every single time someone types a message. It has to run calculations across thousands of computer chips, all of them working at the same time, all of them drawing power, all of them generating heat, all of them requiring cooling systems and buildings and maintenance staff and power contracts with energy companies. Every single conversation costs real money to run. And as the user count climbs, as it went from 100 million to 900 million weekly active users, the number of those conversations multiplied by the same factor. OpenAI planned to spend approximately $50 billion on compute in 2026 alone, not total, in 1 year, and the average target going forward was $100 billion per year through 2030. That is a number so large that it is hard to hold in your head. $100 billion every year, just to keep the lights on for the computers that run the product. A journalist once asked Sam Altman directly whether the math could ever work. Altman said it would, that efficiency would improve, that the cost per computation would fall over time, that revenue would grow faster than costs eventually. The journalist looked at the numbers on the page. Eventually is doing a lot of work in that sentence, she said. Altman smiled. It usually does, he said. And just like that, the gap between the vision and the spreadsheet was visible to anyone who wanted to look. The enterprise side of the business was at least sending the right signals. By August 2026, 92% of Fortune 500 companies were using OpenAI products. Imagine a list of almost every major American corporation. The banks, the retailers, the manufacturers, the tech giants, the pharmaceutical companies, and picture 9 out of 10 of them paying for access to OpenAI's tools. That is what 92% means in this context. Not experimenting, not evaluating, using. The company had surpassed 1 million business customers total, with over 600,000 of those being enterprise customers specifically on ChatGPT. Enterprise customers pay more, they sign longer contracts, and they are less likely to cancel when a competitor launches a new product. That kind of customer base is what investors call sticky. It generates predictable revenue. OpenAI also held a 51.3% market share in the generative AI chatbot sector as of July 2026, more than half the market. That is a genuinely commanding position against competitors including Anthropic, which had itself raised enormous sums and attracted some of the same safety-focused researchers who had left OpenAI. But commanding a market while spending $1.70 to earn $1 is not a sustainable business. It is a bet. The bet is that the cost of compute will fall fast enough, and that revenue will grow fast enough, that the gap eventually closes. Every investor who has put money into OpenAI is essentially betting on that timeline. Which brings us to the biggest single move OpenAI made to try to change the math entirely. On January 21, 2025, OpenAI announced Project Stargate. The concept was straightforward even if the numbers were not. OpenAI had been paying for computing power by renting it, mostly through Microsoft's cloud infrastructure. That arrangement worked when the company was smaller. But at the scale OpenAI was now operating, paying to rent someone else's computers was like a delivery company paying tolls on every single road it used, every single day, forever. At some point, building your own highway is cheaper than paying tolls forever. Project Stargate was OpenAI's highway. The plan was to build brand new artificial intelligence infrastructure across the United States, funded by a $500 billion commitment over 4 years. Not rented, not borrowed, built from the ground up and owned. The project started with $100 billion already committed, and the first data center broke ground in Abilene, Texas. The partners were not small names. SoftBank and OpenAI led the effort. Microsoft, Oracle, and NVIDIA came in alongside them. These are some of the largest technology companies on the planet, all agreeing to build something together that none of them could build alone. The logic was clear. If OpenAI had to spend $50 billion on compute in 2026 anyway, and $100 billion per year after that, then owning the infrastructure those dollars went into was better than sending that money to someone else indefinitely. Building the highway meant the tolls stopped. It meant the long-run cost curve could actually bend downward instead of climbing forever. Whether that bet pays off is still an open question. Building data centers at this scale takes years. The power requirements are enormous. The regulatory approvals alone consume time that the financial clock does not wait for. The Abilene facility was a beginning, not a solution. But it was a signal. A signal that OpenAI was not simply going to keep absorbing losses while renting its way through growth. It was going to try to own the problem. So the picture that emerges by the middle of 2026 is genuinely unusual. A company with 900 million weekly active users, 92% of the Fortune 500 as customers, over 1 million businesses on the platform, a market share above 50%, annualized revenue of $25 billion and climbing, a $500 billion infrastructure plan underway, a conversion to public benefit corporation status that opened the door to investor returns. The safety researchers who built the conscience of the organization mostly gone, the executives who built its operational backbone starting to follow. And underneath all of it, a $20,920 million operating loss sitting on the books like a weight that the revenue, impressive as it is, has not yet lifted. The company is bigger than almost anyone thought possible a few years ago, and somehow it is still drowning in red ink. The compute costs keep climbing. The departures keep coming. The regulatory pressure keeps building. And the only real mechanism left for bringing the math into balance, the one that investors have been waiting for, the one that would let early backers finally convert their paper stakes into something real, is the public markets. Wall Street is waiting, and the clock is running. What that path to the public markets actually looks like became clearer in June 2026, when OpenAI filed its S-1 prospectus with the Securities and Exchange Commission. An S-1 is the document a private company submits before it sells shares to the public for the first time, a formal accounting of the business, its risks, its finances, and its future plans, all laid out for regulators and potential investors to scrutinize. Filing one is not the same as completing an IPO. It is the starting gun, not the finish line. But it was a commitment. The company was saying in writing and under penalty of law that it intended to become a publicly traded company. Chief Financial Officer Sarah Fryer confirmed in August 2026 that the IPO was targeted for 2027, contingent on what she called sustained business momentum. That phrase carries weight. It means the numbers have to keep moving in the right direction. Revenue has to keep growing. The operating loss has to start narrowing, or at least show credible signs of narrowing. Enterprise customer counts have to hold. Market share has to stay above 50% as competitors sharpen their own products. Sustained business momentum is not a guarantee. It is a condition, and conditions can fail to be met. The March 31, 2026 funding round gave the company runway to meet those conditions. $122 billion raised in a single round, the largest single private funding round in corporate history, pushed the post-money valuation to $852 billion. That figure places OpenAI within reach of the small club of companies that have ever been valued above $1 trillion in public markets. Whether the public markets will agree with that valuation when the IPO actually arrives is a question that no prospectus can answer in advance. What is clear is that the shape of the bet has not changed, only the size of it. OpenAI is spending at a scale that would bankrupt most companies and betting that the cost curves will bend before the capital runs out. Project Stargate is the infrastructure answer. Enterprise adoption is the revenue answer. The IPO is the liquidity answer. Each piece depends on the others arriving on schedule. A delay in Stargate construction pushes compute costs higher for longer. A slowdown in enterprise adoption narrows the revenue trajectory. A rough IPO market in 2027 could force a postponement that rattles investor confidence downstream. The pieces are large, and the tolerances between them are tighter than the headline numbers suggest. And watching all of this from the outside, the state attorneys general who subpoenaed the company in June 2026, the SEC investigators still examining the circumstances of the Altman firing, the AI safety researchers who departed and have since spoken publicly about their concerns, is a coalition of voices that has no particular interest in letting the IPO arrive without scrutiny. 42 state attorneys general is not a small group. That is a broad coalition examining business practices, data handling, and safety measures simultaneously. For a company preparing to invite the general public to buy its shares, that kind of attention is not background noise. The story is not over. Not even close. March 31, 2026. A date that most people will never read about in a history textbook, but probably should. On that single day, a private company, one that still loses money at a rate that would make most accountants physically ill, closed the largest single private funding round in the history of corporate finance, $122 billion raised in one round. To put that in a frame your brain can actually hold on to, if you stacked 122 billion $1 bills flat on top of each other, that pile would reach roughly 8,000 miles into the sky. That is more than 30 times the altitude of a commercial airplane. That is nearly a third of the way to the moon. And someone handed that stack to a company spending $1.70 for every dollar it brings in. The post-money valuation landed at $852 billion. What that number actually means is this. Every investor, every fund, every sovereign wealth vehicle that put money in collectively agreed that the entire company was worth $852 billion on that day. That places OpenAI inside striking distance of a club so exclusive it barely exists. Only a handful of companies in history have ever touched or crossed $1 trillion in public market valuation. Apple did it, Microsoft did it, a few others. OpenAI has not crossed that line yet, but $852 billion means it can see the door from where it is standing. Add up every round across the company's entire history, and the total reaches approximately $190 billion. That is not a typo. $190 billion in total capital raised by a company that was originally structured as a nonprofit with no equity to sell. The names behind that capital read like a list of the most powerful financial institutions on the planet. Microsoft, which has been embedded in this story since the beginning. SoftBank, the Japanese conglomerate famous for writing enormous checks in technology companies and tolerating enormous risk. Oracle, Nvidia, whose chips are literally running the AI systems that generate OpenAI's revenue. Thrive Capital, Amazon, and NGX, a technology investment vehicle backed by Abu Dhabi. These are not small venture funds making speculative bets on a garage startup. These are some of the largest pools of money on earth, and they all decided the same thing. that OpenAI is the company most likely to define the next era of computing. But here's the thing. Money at this scale does not arrive without questions. And the question every serious investor is quietly asking is the same one. A skeptical portfolio manager reportedly pushed directly to Sam Altman during the fundraising process. How is a company losing nearly $21 billion a year worth almost $1 trillion? Altman's answer, according to accounts of those conversations, was not a defensive one. He said they are building the infrastructure for the next era of computing, not just a product, not just the chatbot, the actual rails that the next generation of the economy runs on. The investor's response was short and direct. They better be right. That exchange captures the entire bet in 2 lines. Either OpenAI is building something so foundational that the losses today are just construction costs, the way laying railroad tracks costs money before a single ticket is ever sold, or the losses are simply losses, and the valuation is a story that the public markets will eventually refuse to accept. As of July 2026, the market share numbers gave the bulls some ammunition. OpenAI held 51.3% of the generative AI chatbot market. That means more than half of every person on Earth using an AI chatbot at that moment was using an OpenAI product. The competition, Anthropic, Google, and a growing list of others, was sharing the remaining 48.7% between them. Holding more than half of a market that did not exist 5 years ago, in an industry where every major technology company on the planet is trying to take a piece of your lunch, is not easy, and OpenAI was doing it while simultaneously managing the internal pressure that no headline quite captured at the time. Because while the money was flowing in, the people running the company were quietly heading for the exit. August 2026 saw a wave of departures that rattled anyone paying close attention. At least 14 senior leaders left OpenAI over the course of the year. Not junior employees, not mid-level managers, senior leaders. People who had been inside the building when the big decisions were made. Chris Malone, who oversaw the data center strategy, the physical infrastructure that makes everything work, was gone. Denise Dresser, the chief revenue officer responsible for turning the product into actual money, departed. And then Brad Lightcap, the chief operating officer, left after 8 years at the company. 8 years. That is longer than most startups exist at all. Lightcap had been there through the nonprofit era, through the chaos of the Altman firing, through the conversion to a public benefit corporation, and through the early days of explosive revenue growth. And he walked out the door in August 2026, just as the company was preparing to make its biggest public move. Dolly Rogic stepped in as the new chief revenue officer, handed the job of driving sales at a company whose revenue trajectory has to keep climbing for the entire financial story to hold together. Greg Brockman, OpenAI's president, pushed back on the narrative publicly. His argument was that turnover at this scale is not unusual for a company growing as fast as OpenAI, and that the scrutiny the company operates under makes every departure look bigger than it is. When a normal company loses a senior vice president, it shows up in a LinkedIn update. When OpenAI loses a COO, it becomes a news cycle. Brockman's point is that the spotlight distorts the signal, but there is a version of that argument that works and a version that doesn't. The version that works is true. Fast companies do cycle through leadership, especially when the equity structures are complicated and the pace is relentless. The version that doesn't work is when the departures cluster, when they hit the revenue side and the operations side at the same time, right before a company is trying to convince the public that it is stable enough to buy shares in. And that is exactly the moment OpenAI chose to file. In June 2026, OpenAI confidentially submitted its S-1 prospectus to the Securities and Exchange Commission. An S-1 is the registration document a company files when it intends to sell shares to the public. It is the first formal step toward an initial public offering, an IPO. Filing it confidentially means the document is not yet public, but the decision is made. The company is moving toward the open market. Then on August 19, 2026, Chief Financial Officer Sarah Fryer confirmed the timeline during an internal all-hands meeting. The IPO is targeted for 2027, she told the room, provided business momentum continues. That phrase, provided business momentum continues, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. It is CFO language for the fact that the plan has conditions attached to it and conditions can fail. The SEC was already watching. Investigators had opened an inquiry into whether investors were misled during the chaos surrounding the Altman firing in November 2023. The specific concern was whether the information flowing to investors during those 5 days. While the board was firing Altman, Mira Murati was running the company as interim CEO, and employees were threatening to walk. Accurately reflected what was actually happening inside the organization. That investigation had not concluded by August 2026, and sitting alongside the SEC scrutiny was something even broader. In June 2026, a coalition of 42 United States state attorneys general issued subpoenas to OpenAI. 42 states. The subpoenas covered business practices, data handling, and AI safety measures. For context, there are 50 states. 42 of them decided, at roughly the same time, that they had enough questions about this company to demand documents and answers under the force of law. Now layer on the financial picture underneath all of that legal pressure. Sam Altman, the man steering the company through all of it, owned 0% of the equity in OpenAI. He drew a salary of $76,001 in tax year 2023. The man managing a company that is now valued at $852 billion, preparing for a public offering that could push that valuation above $1 trillion, earns less in a year than a mid-level accountant at one of the firms auditing his balance sheet. That detail is not just interesting, it is the core of everything strange about this story, because OpenAI was structured deliberately to prevent any one person from getting rich by controlling the AI. And Sam Altman, by holding no equity, technically fits that structure. He cannot personally cash out at the IPO the way a founder normally would. But the company is still attempting a nearly $1 trillion public offering, still backed by some of the largest financial powers on earth, still generating billions of dollars in revenue for its investors. The money is very much present. It just officially does not belong to the person running the show. That irony is not incidental to the story. It is the story. And it gets more tangled the closer you look at what happens when 42 attorneys general, a federal securities regulator, 14 departed executives, and a CFO talking about conditions for an IPO all occupy the same calendar year. The company that was built to make sure artificial intelligence served humanity rather than the financial interests of a few powerful people is now preparing to sell itself to the public at a valuation that rivals the gross domestic product of most countries. The investors who backed that process are not doing it out of charity. They are doing it because they believe the return will be extraordinary. Whether the public markets agree with that belief when the IPO window opens in 2027 is a question that no S-1 filing can answer in advance, but the attorneys general are asking their own questions first. August 2026 did not arrive quietly for OpenAI. It arrived with a list of names, people who had spent years building the company and were now walking out the door, not one or two, not the kind of turnover any company brushes off with a press release. At least 14 senior leaders departed over the course of that year, and by the time the full picture became clear, analysts were reaching for a phrase that no company wants attached to its name ahead of a public offering: brain drain. Think about what that actually means in practice. You are a company preparing to invite millions of ordinary people to buy your shares. The pitch to those people depends on the strength of the team running the place. And in the same calendar year you file your prospectus with the Securities and Exchange Commission, you lose your data center chief, your chief revenue officer, and your chief operating officer. Chris Malone, who oversaw the infrastructure that keeps the whole operation running, was gone. Denise Dresser, who held the chief revenue officer role and was responsible for the commercial relationships powering that $2 billion in monthly revenue, was gone. And Brad Lightcap, the chief operating officer who had spent 8 years at the company, 8 years, which in the startup world is practically a founding member. He was gone too. 8 years is not a short stint. Brad Lightcap joined OpenAI when it was still operating as a non-profit with a relatively small team. He was there for the ChatGPT launch. He was there for the November 2023 chaos. He lived through the firing, the employee revolt, the reinstatement, and everything that came after. And then, in August 2026, with the IPO filing already submitted and the public offering less than a year away, he left. Greg Brockman, OpenAI's president and one of its original founders, stepped in front of that narrative the way you would expect a company official to do. He pushed back. And he made a fair point, as far as it went. A reporter put the question to him directly. Are 14 departures in 1 year a warning sign? Brockman's answer was measured. He said every fast-moving company loses people. Growth at that speed creates churn. Roles evolve. People want to try other things. The media attention on OpenAI makes every single departure feel like a crisis, but in any other company growing this fast, this level of turnover would not make headlines. The reporter pressed. Are those people being replaced fast enough? Brockman said they are hiring constantly. The company is not standing still. But here is the thing. The reporters asking that question were not the only skeptics. Analysts watching from outside the company used the word brain drain specifically because of who was leaving, not just how many. The concern was not that OpenAI was losing mid-level managers. The concern was that the people who understood the internal mechanics of the company, who knew where the pressure points were, who had lived through the hard decisions, were departing before the moment when their institutional knowledge would matter most. Going public is not just a financial event. It is a stress test on the people running the organization, and you want the people who know the place best to be there when that test happens. Dali Rajic stepped into the chief revenue officer seat in August 2026, replacing Denise Dresser. A new face at a senior level, arriving at exactly the moment when the commercial relationships underpinning the IPO story needed to be locked in and defended. Whether that represents a fresh start or a company cycling through leadership faster than it can build continuity is not a question anyone at OpenAI answered publicly, but it is the question the analysts kept asking. And those analysts were not asking in isolation. They were asking against a backdrop of regulatory pressure that made the leadership picture even more complicated to read. The SEC investigation, as covered earlier in this documentary, started with a very specific question. When Sam Altman was fired in November 2023 and then reinstated 5 days later, investors were caught completely off guard. The board acted, employees revolted, Microsoft applied pressure, and the whole thing resolved itself in less than a week. But the SEC's question was whether the investors who had put money into OpenAI were given an accurate picture of the company and its governance before any of that happened. If they were not, if material information was withheld or misrepresented, that is not just a corporate governance problem. That is a potential legal problem. And for a company about to ask the general public to invest at a valuation approaching $1 trillion, a pending securities investigation is not a footnote. It sits at the center of the due diligence every serious investor will perform before deciding whether to buy shares. The way to think about it is simple. Imagine you are buying a house. Before you sign anything, you ask the seller to disclose every known problem with the property. If they knew about a crack in the foundation and did not tell you, and you find out later, you have legal recourse. The SEC investigation into OpenAI is asking a version of that same question on a much larger scale. Did the people who sold stakes in this company give buyers an honest picture of what they were buying? If the answer is no, the legal exposure is real, and it does not disappear just because the company files an S-1 and rings a bell on a stock exchange. Then there is the coalition of 42 state attorneys general who subpoenaed the company in June 2026. As mentioned earlier, that number is staggering. Nearly every state in the country sent legal demands to OpenAI simultaneously, covering business practices, data handling, and AI safety approaches. Each of those subpoenas requires a legal response. Each one opens a window into the company's internal documents, decisions, and communications. When you are a company trying to present a clean, compelling story to public market investors, 42 separate legal processes demanding your records is exactly the kind of complication that makes underwriters nervous and delays timetables. The timing is worth sitting with. June 2026 is when OpenAI confidentially filed its S-1 prospectus with the SEC, the document that formally begins the process of going public. That same month, 42 attorneys general dropped subpoenas on the company's doorstep. It is possible that the timing was coincidental. It is also possible that the IPO filing accelerated scrutiny from state regulators who had been monitoring the company and decided that a public offering was the moment to demand transparency. Either way, the company was simultaneously filing to go public and receiving legal demands from nearly every state in the country in the same 30-day window. What the executive exits and the regulatory pressure share is that they both make the IPO story harder to tell cleanly. The financial numbers, as established, are extraordinary by any measure. More than half of all people using an AI chatbot are using OpenAI's product. 92% of Fortune 500 companies are paying customers. Monthly revenue of $2 billion. A post-money valuation of $852 billion. Those numbers, in isolation, build a very convincing case. But the people who have to decide whether to buy shares at that valuation are not looking at the numbers in isolation. They are looking at the management team and asking who is left. They are looking at the SEC investigation and asking what the exposure is. They are looking at 42 state attorneys general and asking what documents might surface. They are looking at the operating loss of nearly $21 billion, as mentioned earlier, and asking how long the runway is. And then they are looking at CFO Sarah Fryer, who confirmed on August 19, 2026 at an internal all-hands meeting that the IPO target is 2027, but only if business momentum continues. That last clause is doing a lot of work. Business momentum continuing means revenue keeps growing. It means enterprise customers keep signing contracts. It means the market share number does not slip. It means the regulatory picture does not get materially worse. It means the departures stop and the replacements prove themselves. Every one of those conditions needs to hold simultaneously. Greg Brockman is not wrong that fast-growing companies lose people. That is a real pattern and a fair observation. But the companies that successfully complete IPOs at valuations approaching $1 trillion tend to do it with their most experienced operators still in the building. The people who know where the bodies are buried, figuratively speaking, are usually the people you want sitting across the table from institutional investors during the roadshow. When those people have already left, the roadshow team has to answer questions about the company's history without the institutional memory that comes from having lived through it. And the questions waiting for that roadshow team are not soft ones. They are the SEC's questions about November 2023. They are 42 states' questions about data and safety. They are the analysts' questions about whether Dolly Rogic, stepping into the Chief Revenue Officer role fresh in August 2026, can hold together the commercial relationships that Denise Dresser spent years building. They are the investors' questions about whether a company spending $1.70 for every dollar it earns can reach profitability before its cash position forces a reckoning. None of those questions have comfortable answers yet, and the clock is running because the 2027 IPO window is not far off. The S-1 is filed. The CFO has confirmed the timeline publicly. The process is in motion. What comes next depends on whether the company can answer its skeptics before the moment it asks the public for their money. But to understand what is really at stake in that ask, who actually benefits, what the company is really selling, and whether the original mission survives contact with the public market, you have to look at the one detail that ties every thread of this story together. So, here is where everything lands. The S-1 is filed. The CFO has confirmed the timeline. The 2027 IPO window is open, and the clock is running. But before you can understand what is really at stake when OpenAI asks the general public to buy a piece of it, you have to sit with one fact that does not get talked about enough. Sam Altman, the man leading a company that is approaching $1 trillion in value, owns 0% of it. He earned $76,001 last year. That is less than many of the engineers he manages. He is building what could become one of the most valuable businesses in human history, and he personally holds none of the stock. Every dollar of wealth created by that $852 billion valuation flows to the investors, to the partners, to the funds and sovereign wealth vehicles and technology giants who wrote the checks. Not to him. Not to him. Think about that for a second. The CEO of nearly $1 trillion company is, in a very literal financial sense, working for everyone else. But here's the thing. That arrangement was supposed to be the whole point. OpenAI started as a nonprofit specifically because the founders believed that no single person, no single investor, and no financial interest should be able to steer artificial intelligence toward their own gain. The nonprofit structure was the firewall. No ownership meant no control. No control meant the mission stayed pure. That was the idea. And now the company is preparing to file onto a public exchange and let anyone with a brokerage account buy a piece of it. A retired teacher in Ohio, a hedge fund in Singapore, a day trader in Miami who read a headline about artificial intelligence and decided to take a position. Every one of them, if the IPO goes forward as planned, becomes a partial owner of the organization that was specifically designed so that no one could be a partial owner. The mechanics of getting there are already in motion. In June 2026, OpenAI confidentially filed its S-1 prospectus with the Securities and Exchange Commission. An S-1 is basically a detailed financial report that a company hands to the government before it sells shares to the public. It says, here is who we are, here is what we own, here is what we owe, here is how we make money, and here is every risk we can think of that might cause investors to lose money. Filing it confidentially means the public does not see it yet, but regulators do. It is the first formal step through the door. Then, on August 19, 2026, Chief Financial Officer Sarah Fryer stood in front of employees at an internal all-hands meeting and confirmed that the IPO is targeted for 2027 as long as business momentum holds. That phrase, business momentum, is carrying a lot of weight. It means the revenue growth rate has to keep moving in the right direction. It means the enterprise contracts have to keep renewing. It means the market share number, 51.3% of the generative AI chatbot market as of July 2026, cannot start sliding toward competitors. And it means the regulatory picture, which right now includes an active SEC investigation and subpoenas from 42 state attorneys general, cannot materially deteriorate before the roadshow begins. That is a long list of conditions that all have to hold simultaneously, and every one of them is being watched by people who are not particularly rooting for OpenAI to sail through unscathed. The state attorneys general representing 42 states did not issue those subpoenas in June 2026 because they were curious. They issued them because they want answers about data handling, business practices, and AI safety from a company that is used by 900 million people every week. 900 million. That is a number that puts OpenAI's reach alongside the largest platforms ever built. And those platforms know from experience that regulators who feel left behind do not quietly go away. The SEC's interest is more specific. Investigators want to know whether the people who put money into OpenAI were given an accurate picture of what was happening inside the company during the 5 days in November 2023 when Sam Altman was fired and then reinstated. If investors were misled, that is a serious legal exposure for a company that is about to invite millions of new investors to trust it with their money. And then there is the quieter question, the one that Jan Like raised when he walked out the door not long after Ilya Sutskever resigned in May 2024. Lake was one of the architects of the safety work at OpenAI. He was not a peripheral figure. He was one of the people whose job was to make sure that the products this company ships do not cause harm at scale. And when he left, he said publicly that the superalignment team, the group dedicated to that exact problem, had been losing the argument inside the company. They were getting fewer computing resources than the product TMs. Their concerns were not winning the internal debates. The people building things to sell were getting more runway than the people asking whether those things were safe to sell. Since then, nothing about that dynamic has visibly changed. And the products that came out of the period Like was describing are now used by more than 500 million people every week. Whatever guardrails exist, whatever safety measures are baked in, they were built in an environment where, by the account of one of the people building them, safety was losing ground to speed and scale. This is the part of the story where the founding logic of OpenAI gets hardest to defend. The organization was created because a group of researchers and technologists genuinely believed that artificial general intelligence, if it ever arrived, needed to be developed carefully and shared broadly rather than controlled by any one company or motivated by profit. That was a real belief held by real people who put serious thought into it. The nonprofit structure was not a tax strategy. It was a philosophical commitment, but the commitment ran into reality. Building AI at the scale required to stay competitive costs, money that no mission statement can generate. It cost the kind of money that only comes from investors who want returns. Every check that came in, from Microsoft, from SoftBank, from Amazon, from the funds and sovereign wealth vehicles that participated in the $122 billion round, came from people and institutions that expect to get more out than they put in. That is not a criticism. That is how capital works. But it is worth being honest that the original philosophical commitment and the current financial structure are not pointing in the same direction. The company now projects spending $50 billion on computing in 2026 alone, with a target of $100 billion per year through 2030. To justify that spending to a public market, OpenAI has to keep growing revenue faster than those costs grow. That means more users, more enterprise contracts, more products, faster. It means the 92% of Fortune 500 companies currently using OpenAI products have to keep renewing and expanding their agreements. It means the over 600,000 enterprise customers have to stay. It means the new Chief Revenue Officer, Dali Rajic, who stepped into the role in August 2026 after Denise Dresser left, has to build on relationships he did not personally create. And it means that the product, the thing all of those users are actually interacting with, has to keep getting better fast enough that people do not look at a competitor and decide to switch. Which brings you to your role in this story. Because every time you open that chat window and type a question, you are doing several things simultaneously. You are getting an answer, yes. But you are also generating a data point that feeds back into the model. You are proving the usage statistics that underpin the valuation. You are one of the 900 million weekly users whose engagement is the core argument that OpenAI makes to every investor. You are the proof of concept. You are the reason the number keeps climbing. And if the IPO goes through as planned, your continued use of that product is the single most important driver of whether the shares trade up or down on the day they go public and every day after. That is the architecture of what has been built here. A company founded to make sure no one owned AI is preparing to be owned by anyone who can afford a share. A company founded to make sure profit did not distort the mission is now entirely dependent on profit to survive. A CEO who built all of it owns none of it and earns less than a first-year software engineer. The people who built the safety system said they were losing the internal arguments. And the product of all of that, the chatbot, the model, the assistant that sits in the pocket of over 500 million people every week, keeps growing, keeps being used, keeps climbing in value. OpenAI set out to make artificial intelligence safe for all of humanity. Whether it succeeded at that or just got very, very good at making money might depend entirely on who you ask. And now, you are one of the people being asked. If someone talked to you like an adult about how this actually works and where it is actually going, tap like and subscribe so more people get honest information about the technology that is already reshaping their lives.